And welcome back to another episode of Magnus and Marcus on Coaching. I am Steve Magnus, the Deputy Director of High Performance West, coach at the University of Houston, joined by my good friend, colleague, John Marcus.
We're back, giving the people what they want. Steve, what do the people really want?
Right now they want health, right?
Always, man. I always want health.
Always want health. And to get health and to make sure that we are safe and secure, what often we need is life insurance.
And we need more life, so we might need more insurance for that.
That's right.
Where can they get that?
They can get that at Health IQ, which is a really innovative company. That's why we're great to partner up with them, because they give savings based on if you are living an active and healthy lifestyle. If you run, lift weights, bike, just throw your race results out there, throw your Strava out there to them, and you'll have some pretty immense savings. So life insurance is something that often we don't think about until we kind of need it. So take time, think about that. Go to healthiq.com/oncoaching. You can find that in the show notes at highperformancewest.com or Science of Running, and check that out.
And don't forget, too, we're giving away 2 $100 checks to members, or not just members, audience folk that have been listening from day one, or today if today's your first day listening to us. All you have to do is go to highperformancewest.com. There's a tab that says $100. Click on it, fill out the quick, easy form there, and then Steve and I will pick 2 people at random and send them checks for $100 in the mail. And then we'll also actually send those people an additional $100 check each to give away to something that they deem fit. So it can be any kind of cause you champion. It can be an in-need athlete. It can, whatever it is, just let us know what you do end up doing with that donation $100 check, so we can highlight that, call it out, because that's what High Performance West is about, paying it forward and making a generous contribution. So we're very thankful to have a sponsor, and it's because of the people we do have a sponsor, and we're happy to pay it forward and give it back.
And what are we talking about today?
I don't know. We got an awesome, amazing, fabulous guest on. Who is it, Steve?
We do. Alex Hutchinson. So Alex is someone whose work I've read for a really long time. Started off with his own little blog, I believe, Sweat Science, and then moved to Runner's World, and then moved to Outside. He's become a good friend, and most recently has written the absolutely fantastic book, Endure, which, it's a good book. Like, Alex, before we, get done with the introduction, how long did it take you to research and write that book?
First of all, hello guys, and thanks for having me. And yeah, I started telling people I was interviewing back in 2009. I said I'm working on a book, and I'm sure they all gave up on it a long time ago, but it finally did make it to the light of day.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean. You can tell you were thorough with it. It was a slow cook. Very in-depth book. Like, you left no stone unturned. I'm sure you left a lot on the editing floor, but man, it was good. So thank you for writing it. The endurance community is better off for it. And before we get into the podcast, what's your favorite part of the book? Like, when you go through and you read it and you reflect on it in the writing process, and then also too now in the published process. Your chapter, or at least the section that has a fun story or a very memorable story about how it was birthed, or just how thorough of a job you had to do to make it come to fruition.
Yeah, it's interesting. In terms of favorite parts, like, since it was cooking for so long, a lot of it became very familiar to me, so it no longer seemed so surprising. But the part that still blew my mind, so as an endurance athlete, you think about oxygen a lot. So I wanted to sort of strip away all the extra stuff and find out in what ways is oxygen really limiting. And that led me to reading up about free diving and looking into all the there's actually some pretty amazing research about extreme breath holding and stuff like that. And so to cut to the chase, the stuff about people holding their breath for 11 minutes and 35 seconds and understanding how that happens, that was the stuff that blew my mind and was freshest and most surprising to me. In terms of the stuff that, and I have to say, like, I now that the book's out, I don't reread it because it's like it's painful. Just it's always hard to kind of stare in the mirror that way. But if I do catch myself, I still like that. In the first chapter, I tell the story of, which was really the origin story of how I got interested in this topic, which is my sort of weird and wild transformation where I got better at 1,500 meters because someone called out the wrong splits. And I have to admit, and then I try and mix that story with Roger Bannister's story, which is one that's really close to my heart, that really meant a lot to me as a runner. And that chapter is probably my favorite to look at and sort of say, hey, I have a book and it has hard covers on it and everything like that.
Man, Alex, it's like you're reading off my notes. I was about to tell you how much I enjoyed the free diving one, because it's just different enough and I learned so much from it. And then the second part of that is, we actually had a very similar situation here at Houston Indoors to what you described in your own experience, right? Someone actually started the official timer split clock 3 seconds too late. And I kid you not, we had kids, like my 2 milers in there, PR'd by I think like 7 seconds.
Wow.
And it was, for those who haven't read Endure, like that was, the beginning grab you story that you told, where you went from knocking at the doors of 4 minutes in the 1500 to just smashing through it.
Yeah, exactly. It was that was 1996 for me, and it was exactly that. It was a 3-second mistake in the splits that made me think I was going faster, and I ended up PRing by 9 seconds, and then in the next 2 races taking another 7 seconds off. And it was just one of those things that shows you the brain can do some funny things when you're not expecting it. And I'm glad to know that your anecdote lends credence to the fact that I'm not just making this up. It really did happen.
Oh, man, that's awesome. Well, yeah, since this is the On Coaching podcast and Steve and I are coaches, and you've been coached by a variety of established and, well-known, as also not as well-known, but amazing coaches. Kind of take us through your own coaching journey or being coach journey, as an athlete, and now transitioning kind of more to the theoretical or scientific side, and then how what's your impetus to offer this workout to the community, the coaching community, and what you hope like coaches like us and coaches listening can take away from either the nuggets of knowledge you share in Endure, or that you share, currently in your writings online with online or Outside Magazine, and as well as just your own generous works that you continue to contribute to the community as a whole.
Okay, so this is going to be a 2-hour answer.
That was a long. That was a long question. So I'll simplify, because John's a philosophy guy, man. He'll just go on and on. Let's go to the start. Like let's maybe talk about the different types of coaches you had and contrast those out.
Yeah, for sure. So I got serious when I was about 15 in high school. The way things work up in Canada, we have so I'm in Toronto, I'm from Canada, and it's a hybrid system up here. Kind of in most things in life, we're halfway between the US and the UK. And so, like the US, we have high school track and high school sports, but like the UK, we also have a club system. And most kids who are at all serious about running, I'm generalizing, but most kids, if you're a reasonably serious runner, you'll end up running with a track club rather than with your high school. So I joined a track club when I was 15. Basically, I had done well enough in the city championships that a local coach called my school and said, "Hey, if this kid wants to come and join the real guys, he can come and train with us." And I was flattered enough that I figured I would give it a shot. And so I trained with a coach named Ross Restuccia, who was with the University of Toronto Track Club, and he came out of there's a sort of a genealogy in Toronto track that dates back to Bruce Kidd in the 1960s, who is I guess he ran 13:43, I think, as a 17-year-old or something like that. Was one of the best guys in the world. Anyway, there was a group at U of T, and there were coaches that came through that system, and Ross had been a student at the University of Toronto. He'd actually been when he was a high school runner, he trained with Andy Higgins, who was later the University of Toronto coach. So he was a high school coach training with, like, the workout templates were very similar to what had come out of this sort of Bruce Kidd school of the 60s and 70s. And what that meant is it's pretty classic. It's like there's no crazy weird stuff there, but we had some pretty standard workouts for high school kids. 8x600, 6x800, 5x1000, relatively short rest. Fill up the rest of the week with mileage. So I was doing two workouts a week. What seemed to me just like the plain vanilla classic, 5K of hard work twice a week, and as much mileage as you can tolerate outside of that. And I ran okay on that. I ran really well initially off that, and then I had mono in my last year of high school, and so I kind of plateaued as I mentioned in the book. When I went to university, this is when the first time, so to me that was just how you run. That's the way it works. And it was kind of, even though I was reading, I read a lot of like Tim Noakes, Lore of Running, all that sort of stuff, and Bannister, but it was still a surprise to me. I went to university at McGill, where the head coach, it's in Montreal, and the head coach is a guy named Dennis Barrett, who was a 400, 800 meter runner in college. I think it was at New Mexico State, maybe. And it was a very different approach. The interesting thing was in cross country, we actually ran workouts that seemed fairly similar to me. But as soon as track came, come December, we started training in a totally different way. So we'd be doing, 4 by 1,000 with 7 minutes rest, or 12 by 150 with actually quite a surprising amount of rest. Those were our staple workouts, even for like 3,000 meter runners. And honestly, like that was my first sort of crisis of faith. I didn't believe it was possible to run in this way. And I still, I can't say I would prescribe 4 by 1,000 with 7 minutes rest to anybody. But what happened to me is I ran like absolute crap for my first year, and I ran like absolute crap for partway through my second year, which was sort of I attributed that to the fact that the workouts weren't the workouts I was used to. And partway through my second year, I had a kind of come to Jesus moment where I was like, and the system was that you did the coach's workouts or you couldn't run for the team. And I kind of thought to myself, well, I'm running like absolute crap. I'm second guessing every workout. I'm trying to, whenever the coach isn't looking, I'm sneaking off and cutting the rest in half, or because I think I know better. And I just realized, if I'm going to run for this team, this is going to be a miserable 4 years unless I just kind of buy into what the program is. And I remember I came to work out one day partway through my second year and said, okay, I'm going to stop. I didn't say this out loud because I didn't want to, but in my head, I was like, I may not agree with the workouts, but if I'm going to be here and I'm going to train in this program, I'm going to give them 100%. And it was I think the workout was like 8 by 300, 8 times 300. And I was like, and normally I would say, well, this is I'm a distance runner. I shouldn't be trying to run as hard as I can for 300s, so I'm going to try and cut the rest short and everything. I said, okay, screw it. If the goal is we're supposed to go as fast as we can in these 300s, I'm going to gun it. And I ran like 38, 39, 39, 41, 43, 63. And then I said, coach, I don't think I can finish the workout. But he could see that I had finally kind of bought in, and that, I had a big breakthrough that year in the 800, and then the next year I had my big breakthrough in 1500. I definitely don't necessarily think those workouts were optimal, but I think that was an important moment for me in realizing that sometimes the details are less important than the mindset, that I was constantly undercutting myself by not believing in what we were doing. And it was better to be 100% committed to a suboptimal program than 60% committed to the perfect, or than to not be able to than to not have that 100% commitment. So anyway, that was McGill. After that, I went over to Britain.
Can we stop?
Yeah.
Let's put a pin because that's too valuable, Alex.
Yeah, you dropped a lot of nuggets.
Yeah. Let's stop there because I think that is like the thing that probably holds back younger runners or even older runners the most, right? Is they have this idea that the training plan has to be perfect, or it has to be like some idealized version of what has worked for them in the past, in order to run fast. But looking at it, retrospectively now, and knowing what you know about, like, from training to the science of it, like how much do you rate that almost buy-in versus the actual physiological, variables?
So, yeah, I've thought about this a lot, and we can talk more about this. But like, I think it is possible to do workouts that are absolute garbage. Like, there is a point at which it's like, you'd be better off sitting on the couch than doing 1,000 times 400 meters or whatever. But there's a very, very broad range where I think the details are really, really only matter at the margin, and getting the mindset and things like that right is more important. And I always feel sort of funny saying this kind of thing, because it sounds like I'm sort of dismissing the reality of physiology, and which I don't. But it's like if you're doing 5 by 1,000 versus 6 by 1,000, if you're doing 2 minutes rest versus 3 minutes rest, yeah, there are measurable differences in what those workouts mean. But ultimately, if you're getting I think like the more important parameters are things like, how tired are you at the end of that workout? How hard did you work? Because if you're worried about the difference between 5 by 1,000 versus 6 by 1,000, well, if it's 5, just go harder. And if it's 6, go a little bit easier. If it's 2 by 1,000, you're not going to get, then you're out of that comfort zone. But I really think within a sort of range of common sense, the details are far less important than we think. And certainly, as you were sort of suggesting, then the 15-year-olds on the message boards lamenting how stupid their high school coaches are, maybe realize that there's this sort of epidemic of self-doubt that's been fueled by the internet, I think.
Well, I think, everyone's searching for the holy grail. What's the perfect workout, perfect system? Can we be empowered by physiology? Can we be empowered by psychology? Can we be empowered by whatever, your god or goddess is, to say, this is what's going to give me confidence to then operate under this construct or this paradigm that will lead me to the promised land, which is, which everyone wants is their best incarnation of themselves. 9 times out of 10, though, right, we are sitting here talking about time. Time as the measure. Time as the fundamental only measure for the best that you can be. Steve and I, we try to say it is a measure to be considered, an important one, don't get us wrong, but it has to be coupled with how competitive are you. If we're in the world of performance is not just this pure exhibitionist thing, such as like trying to break 4 for the 2-hour marathon, or trying to break 2 for the marathon or 4 for the mile, and just doing a time trial essentially by yourself with everyone watching. That has its place and is exciting, but competition is the crucible that 99.999% of us are preparing for, and that performance element has a deep psychological narrative infused. You have to be able to be engaged in what you're doing and find a reason to persevere and endure, if you will, even when conditions are suboptimal, right? It's torrential downpour, it's a tornado, thunderstorm, it's sideways wind coming at you at 20 miles an hour. What happens to that when the athlete is constantly trying to find the perfect training plan, the perfect splits, the perfect progression of this, and then go to these perfect environmental races where it's perfect pacing, and it's too much perfect, right? It's like, and then all of a sudden they get to the rounds of a championship where it's like, it's hot and humid or cold and windy, and they completely flounder. You kind of express that once you gave yourself permission here and you set yourself free, all of a sudden it wasn't necessarily, it didn't matter if you agreed or not with the workout. You just bought in, and then you said, I'm going to make the most of it. And then all of a sudden you saw this huge return. How do you reconcile that? Like now, looking back in the rearview mirror, how important was that permission to what you were doing versus being your own psychological barrier or obstacle, because you're second guessing yourself every step of every run and workout?
Yeah, honestly, that 300 workout I just described, I don't think it had any particular physiology meaning. That's still probably the fastest I've ever run a 300. That first interval workout, quite honestly. But it's not like that workout was a physical breakthrough for me. But I don't think I would have made the progress I ever would have made if I hadn't had that specific psychological or mental conversation with myself about belief. And I think it's one that, you like to think that you learn a lesson and it becomes, and you've learned it once and for all, but that's not really the way things work. You often have to relearn the same lesson over multiple times. And it's one that, I had lots of ups and downs in my running career, certainly more downs than ups. But often, I'd come to a point where I'd be realizing, I'm caught in that same loop again, where I'm expecting things to be a certain way, or I'm all about, I have to nail these certain workouts in order to be ready to race. And instead of just sort of building that general belief in myself of being capable of responding to whatever the circumstances are, or I've moved for career reasons. I'm no longer training with a group that I'm comfortable with. I no longer have the training partners I used to. I no longer have the coach. How can I run well? So in a sense, I had to relearn that lesson over and over again a number of times and try and recapture the like, hey, the details, don't get mired in the details. Remember the big picture about believing in what you're doing overall. So I think it was crucial. I think it was more important than, I think you could have written a completely different set of workouts for me, but with the same mindset, I would have got to roughly the same place.
Well, contrast that now with, continuing your journey of being coached, and then say moving on with Centrich Senior, who, he doesn't take any BS, as we know. So, and you're a very, intelligent, analytical, and reflective, person. So how did that relationship work? I'm curious to know.
Yeah. So to give some context, I moved to Washington in 2000 and just the beginning of 2002. So I was 26 then, I guess. And I was coming back. I just coming back from injury at that point, but I had run 342 at that point, and I spent the next 2.5 years training with Centro's group, which was at the time a sort of remnants of what used to be the Reebok Enclave in Washington. So there were some fast guys around, Andre Williams and Pete Sherry, guys who'd run in the sort of 1330 range. And yeah, Centro Senior is a legend, right? Like, so a lot of people have heard the stories, and he's a character. And my experience with him, I in a sense, I kind of wish I could go back in time and do it again with a little more, context and sort of having thought these things through. But it was difficult in some ways for me because, yeah, Centro is the most intuitive coach I've ever worked with. He was all about feeling all the things that I've just been giving lip service to over the last 5 minutes, saying, oh, you have to have confidence in yourself. You have to, don't fret about the details. He was the sort of Yoda of that kind of thing. Whereas I was like, okay, but how fast am I supposed to run this thing? Or, like, when are we going to race? Like, what are my goals? What are my season goals? How am I going to progress to the point where I want to run this qualifying time? I'm not going to do it my first time out. So if I want to get into the fast heat at Stanford, then I need to have run fast enough here. So I need to run a icebreaker there so that I can go here to run fast enough to get into Stanford to run the qualifying time I want for anyway. I was a mess, right? Like I was an analytical guy, and Centro was a college coach, a busy college coach who would let some post-collegiate guys train with his group, but was not like, you communicated with Centro via his answering machine. He never picked up the phone, but you would call and leave a message on his analog answering machine to let him know how the workout went and to kind of cry into the phone saying, please, to return my call, tell me when I'm going to race.
It's like reminds me like 12 Monkeys, right? You remember that movie with Brad Pitt and Bruce Willis? Like, you just leave an answer. Okay, I hope you guys in the future will get this. I need to be beamed back. Like
that was what it felt like. And I was monkey number 13, the one who I was just the Canadian kid. I was not that fast. I was not that. Anyway, it was a challenge for me, and all these other things. Like, I mean, I could, again, I could do 2 hours on the experience of running for Centro. Like, if you ask me about things like splits and worrying about pace, I'll say you need to learn to internalize it. We shouldn't be too reliant on gadgets. That's what I write in articles, right? Well, when I was training with Centro, the situation would be like, okay, I want you to run this, this 1200 64s, and don't screw up. And so I'm taking off leading a group. I'm supposed to run 64 for the first lap. And it's like, I feel like the world's going to explode if I don't. So it went from the point where I'd be checking my watch at 400 to then I would start checking at 200 first, just to make sure I wasn't screwing up the pace. And before long, I was checking literally, and I kid you not, I would check my splits at 100, 200, 300, and then 400 to make sure when I came through, everything was going to be okay. Now, the reality, as I later learned, is that Centro usually missed the start with his watch anyway and was just making up a time that he would yell at you when you went by. He didn't give a damn, but I was stressed about it, and so he would see me checking, and then he would say, hey, Canadian, take off your damn watch. Throw it in the infield. So I'd be in the middle of a mile rep or something, and I'd have to take off my watch and throw it in the infield and hope that people didn't step on it. And, there's nothing more naked feeling than being a time-obsessed analytical runner trying to hit your splits and not having a watch on and knowing that your coach isn't really timing it, he's just pretending to. So it's like there's so much wisdom there that I feel like I could have gained, but it was too big a step for me at the time. I had a lot of trouble with it.
Well, it's a security, right? It's a security blanket. Having the hard, fast, quantitative measures, right? It gives you the security that you did or didn't do a good job. And when you're talking to Yoda, who's more like qualitative about it, and you're saying, well, feel it, be one, ohm type deal. You're like,
be the ball.
Yeah, be the ball.
In Caddyshack, yeah.
Yeah, it's like people, it puts people kind of in this blizzard or a fog, and there's no way to orient yourself, right?
Yeah.
And so,
what am I going to write in my training log? If I don't know the split, what am I going to write for that interval? Like, it's going to be a disaster. My training log is going to have an estimate instead of the correct time.
And I mean, that's the thing about track, right? We have precision. Like, we measure time on the track down to the 100th of a second, right? I mean, we can go to the thousandths if we wanted. And place does count. So we do have, it's tough to reconcile. Like, we keep score for a reason. It matters, right? But at the same time, the process to get the outcome has to be much more improv. A spirit of play, like a spirit of improv, a spirit of, okay, let's explore and discover, rather than let's execute with precision this race strategy and plan that's about running each lap at this exact pace. Instead, being ready to do what matters at the crucial moment in a race to compete to the best of your ability. And it's a very tough bridge, and I struggle with that a lot too with athletes, and myself included when I was an athlete, to get from one side of the cliff to the other as a coach or as an athlete, to have faith or trust and belief in this very big pie in the sky thing called the process. And how's the process actualize these very hard and fast outcomes that we seek as well, where there's lots on the line, right? Whether it's hard, fast dollars, whether it's prestige or esteem, or whether it's just a satisfaction for any athlete of a job well done and having all the work and effort and energy put into it. Steve, what about you? Like, how have you, being, outnumbered here 2-1 science to philosophy guys today, how have you kind of reconciled that?
Yeah, no, I mean, as an athlete, I was much more like Alex, right?
Yeah.
I recorded everything. I mean, I had my miles to, before GPS watches, down to, the point, right? Very much similar to what Alan Webb kind of does too with his workout splits and stuff like that. I had everything. And I think it's really about, learning these lessons like Alex talked about in here, and like letting go a little bit and understanding what's important. I would argue, and I'm curious to hear, Alex, your take on this. I would argue when you're an athlete, you think the workout splits are important because you need them, like you need to hit those to give you the confidence to race, because you think if I do this in a workout, then I'll do, Y in a race. Well, as a coach, like you quickly see that isn't the value that we get out of workouts.
Yeah, boy, I have a lot to say on that. Like, first of all, just directly to your point there. So there were these older, wiser veterans in Centro's group, and one of them was Pete Sherry. And I remember him saying to me early on, like, listen, the goal isn't to go faster every time we do a workout as the season progresses. And he said he had this conversation with Bob Kennedy, and he said what Bob Kennedy told him is, look, the goal is to run the same splits, but to feel better doing it. At the end, maybe you'll be doing these miles still in 4:24. Basically, I think what I was saying was that the point isn't the point isn't to run, as Steve was saying, the point isn't to run X in a workout, run as fast as you can so that it leads to the fastest possible race. That's not how it works. You don't get to trade in 6 4:20 miles in workouts for a 13:30 in a race. That's, so you have to change your mindset to getting what you need out of the workout, not just marking up the scoreboard. But I also wanted to just pick up on something John said before about finding that balance between the the sort of analytical side and the feeling side, which is that I guess like 5 or 6 years later, after I trained with Centro, I was back in Toronto, not training quite as seriously, but training with a bunch of actually back training with my old high school coach, but with a bunch of other post collegiate runners. We had a great group, and I was much more by this point. I was kind of a convert to Centro's point of view, and we did a cross country build up where we didn't actually do any measured loops for almost the whole season. We were out doing grass loop training, and we had a good enough group that we could push each other, and we were doing great workouts, but we never went to the track, and we did have some measured grass loops, but we didn't do them that particular fall. And what happened is we showed up for the National Cross Country Championships, and we all ran disappointingly. We all ran slower than we had the year before, and that we were sure we were capable of. And I think that we had kind of let the pendulum swing too far to the other side, that you need some accountability. Like John was saying, like the times do matter. That's how we measure performance. And so at a certain point, if you're just saying, I just want to go out there every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday and feel good. No, sometimes you need to go out and say, well, how does this feeling good correspond to how fast I can run for a bunch of K reps? And if it's not as fast as you think it is, then you have to say, okay, actually, I need to I need to push a little harder. I need to get out there. So I do think it's not all about like just feeling good is feeling fast. Sometimes you do need some splits. You do need some accountability and external sources.
Well, you make a good point there, because you're almost calibrating, right? You need points to like calibrate against like a known standard, and that's what certain workouts do, right? They give us a feel of like, oh, this is how it feels. This is kind of where I'm at, versus kind of just going all by feel. You never have that calibration, and you never fine tune that sensor.
And you can think of that in the micro and the macro scale. So on the season scale, you need some workouts that you know how fast that workout should go, and occasionally you need to check in on that. Within a workout, it's like, I'm all in favor of knowing how fast you're going if you're doing a track workout. I'm all in favor of taking splits, just not every 100 meters. So it's like you need to, or even worse with the GPS watch, not every 10 meters. So it's like you said, it's a question of calibrating to make sure you're on course without having your eyes glued to the calibration device.
And sometimes it needs to be, I famously try to remind my athletes that watch's job is to record, not necessarily direct, right? So you record the session, and then afterwards you can get as many splits as you'd like, and then see trends or see patterns, and see, you can take as many data sets if you want. You can take 200 meter splits, 100 meter splits, but if during the activity it's removing you from the activity and removing you being present in that process, and instead of saying, okay, I need to analyze mid-stride what time I'm running for that previous 100 and then make this micro adjustment, you're ultimately distinguishing or using up your emotional bandwidth, right, for the more important work, which is to say, okay, how do I translate this familiarization of running at this rhythm internally with also externally where I am in the pack, if it's a workout with a group, or if external conditions, and then how can I use that to my advantage come race day, so I'm not completely crippled by the fact when I'm going at what's this perceived effort to be 15 seconds for 100 or 60 seconds for 400, and the watch says 65, right? And that's an important shift, because I always say it's a balanced plate. We know the most nourishing meals are well balanced, and when you go too heavy one way, all analytics, or you go too heavy the other way, all kind of this, as Lauren Fleshman says, like this woo-woo, like just very, hippie-ish mentality, like it's just all good, take some deep breaths, and we will just, have the wind guide us forward. You can't really give anyone a concrete direction. You're going to be at a loss. And I think every athlete has a different balance profile, because I remember, for balance is not a direct ratio, it's the correct proportion for that person that empowers them, because that's ultimately, right, the goal of working out is to feel empowered, is to feel like, okay, I can go do something very difficult, I can go show up and create something from nothing. That's what a race is. A race is a very creative process. You're birthing it from scratch. But if you're not empowered, then what's the purpose of the busy?
Yeah. So that's really important points, and I think two things that jump out at me. First of all, what you were saying about how to use data, which I think is a really broad point of importance in the age of wearables. I am 100% on board with what you said about collect data to look at it, use it to describe what you're doing rather than to prescribe what you're doing in the moment. So I think there's a ton of great use for data. I think it's dangerous if you're trying to look at it, if you're trying to let the data tell you what to do as opposed to tell you what you did. So I think that's an amazing approach. The other thing about the balance between that's different for different people, and again, coming back to Centro, he had great success with, and he has continued to, but he had great success with some athletes. And I would sometimes ask, so when I was training there were two guys, Sean O'Brien and Sean Duffy, who were both like high 330, 1500 guys. And, obviously they ran really well. And sometimes I'd be like, guys, how do you handle this? It's like yesterday he told me to run 10 miles. I ran 10 miles. Today he yelled at me for running 10 miles. He said, why didn't you run 6? Like he explicitly told me to do that. And they'd be like, dude, relax, man. Like, sometimes things don't make sense with Centro, but if you just sort of relax, don't worry about the details, and listen to what he says, he'll get you where you need to go. He knows what the ultimate prize is. And so they were able to kind of, even when they were sort of sometimes getting contradictory instructions or whatever, they didn't stress about it, and they were able to kind of put that aside and have faith that he was taking them in the right place. And I remember at one point they both qualified for NCAAs, and they were heading off to run the 1500 NCs. And so he took them aside to give them some advice on how to run a tactical 1500, a championship 1500 race. And he pulled me aside too, because he knew I was running sort of not quite at that level, but close to it. And he gave this long explanation of like, okay, the semifinals of a championship 1500, it's all about timing and tension. It's kind of like, when you walk into a bar and you can just feel in the air, there's going to be a fight. You don't know who's going to have the fight. You don't know where it's going to come from, but there's going to be a fight. And what you need to do is just kind of feel that tension in the air. And just before the first punch is going to get thrown, bam, you throw it. And so I'm sitting there thinking like, I've never even seen anybody throw a punch. I have no idea what you're talking about. I've never seen a bar fight. I don't know. What do you mean by tension? How do I measure it? But so I was kind of on the wrong wavelength, but for the, but I could also see that for Sean and Sean, who were about to head to the NCAAs, they were able to kind of pick up the message he was giving them. And they were both very good. They were classic guys, in fact, who were better in championship racing than in time trials, that they ran some of their best times responding to other people and being able to feel that kind of tension of the pack. And you look at Matt Centrowitz Jr. now. What is his brilliance? His brilliance is feeling the tension in the pack. You look at that Olympic final. It's like he was feeling the punches before they came and fending them off or throwing his own jab. And it's like, I wish I was better than that, and I wish I'd had longer in my career to kind of try and learn that from Centro, even though it definitely was not my sort of intuitive strength.
Well, it's a magnitude of correctness versus frequency of correctness, right? The frequency of correctness is I hit every split, I ran every mile, I have all this data that reaffirms, creates this blanket of security that I'm ready to go. And then because you operate with that mindset, you get to a championship race where it's much more subtle. It's much more undefined. You don't know what's going to happen because everyone's more jockeying and competing against the other person rather than competing with the clock or competing against their own ability, right? And that's the brilliance of, like, say, Centro here. He knew the magnitude of correctness. The thing that mattered most was his ability to perform or throw the first punch in that type of setting. Right, that counsel is much different for a round of a championship race of a 1500 than it is, say, going to Oxy or Portland Track Festival or something, or Monaco, and just lighting it out from the first step.
Yeah. And your story there kind of reminds me of actually what Danny Mackey said on a recent podcast when he was talking about Drew Windle winning a silver medal at the World Indoors. He was saying, like, hey, the key to tactics is not to react, but to anticipate it, right? To know, hey, I've seen this movie before, here's what's about to come, and, like, I have to be the one to, like, dictate and take control. And as you said, that's what Centrowitz Jr. does absolutely brilliantly.
Yeah, and of course we'd all like to think we could learn to be like Centro. Obviously, he has some great like just intuition, but I think that is definitely something that you can get better at. And I know that looking back at my own racing experience, I sort of got locked into trying to chase fast times, and all I wanted to do was get in a rabbited race, tuck in near the back, turn my mind off till the last 300. And I think that was to my detriment, not just in terms of championship racing, but I think, who knows, I think I might have been able to run faster sometimes had I not just had that time trialing mindset that I got into. And I think I'm a big believer now in picking some races where you just take tactical risks and experience what it's like to blow up a lap from the finish, like or whatever you don't do normally. Try that and just kind of feel what different tactics are like, because I do think and I'm certainly not, I don't think I was alone in this, got fossilized into one way of running races instead of being able to react to the circumstances.
Yeah, there are two different types of skills, and I'm going to take you on a tangent here, but that's what we're known for, which is interesting because I think it kind of ties into this. Is I have to ask you about the sub 2 hour marathon attempt, right? Because the reason that is because that is a straight, tuck in, turn your mind off and go, right? Versus a tactical kind of skill set type race here. But what's interesting about that sub 2 attempt is arguably, for the three who ran it, one knocked it out of the park, one ran pretty solid, and one blew up, yeah. Right? So as the person with feet on the ground over there and going through what we just talked about, these two separate skills of time trial versus racing, and looking at someone, Kipchoge, who has both of those skills, like what was your maybe big takeaway from being over there and seeing that live?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting, and I would say it was really interesting, despite all the controversy. Like let's get that on the table. That of course there was lots to dislike about a big sort of staged event like that, but I think simultaneously it was also absolutely fascinating, and especially the way it played out. And it is interesting what you say about the different mindsets. Like De Sissa, who ran 2:14 or something like that, Larissa De Sissa, he was selected for the project on the basis of, first of all, he had great lab tests. His physiological parameters were impressive, but his competitive resume was that he had done well. He had won Boston twice. He had run well in New York. He had run well at Worlds. These are all head-to-head, mano-a-mano kind of races where time is meaningless. And there may have been there was certainly other stuff going on with De Sissa in that he didn't, he got injured before, and he was running like 200 miles a week and trying to compensate. And so who knows what his potential was on that day, but I think there's something to the idea that he hadn't really demonstrated that he was a good time trial marathoner. He maybe needed to be feeling like he was trading blows with someone, and he may be good at that kind of intuitive feeling other people's weaknesses, knowing when to move, because he had demonstrated that in other races. Kipchoge, as you said, he's obviously got both. He's won big races on the track. He's got a great kick, but he also proved to be able to really run the sort of ultimate feedback-free race where there's nothing going on except just trying to stick with that car. And in terms of my perspective or what I took away from that, it keeps evolving actually as time goes on. Because with more perspective, first of all, one thing that I can say that I wouldn't have known right after the race, it's like, no, De Sissa and Tedesca didn't end up going and running 2:03 or 2:04 that fall, and maybe they will this spring. But it's like I was surprised, and talking to the scientists, they all thought, okay, yeah, they blew up because they were trying to run 2 hour pace, which was too much. But if we'd had them on 2:03, 2:04 pace, we would have seen something special from De Sissa and Tedesca. And that has definitely not been the case. So it sort of it makes me reflect, or sort of think carefully about whether they really knew what those guys were capable of, and whether, how much of their disappointing performance in breaking 2 was because they just weren't as fit as they could have been, and how much was because of the specific circumstances of the race. But the other big takeaway that has kind of grown on me, I think, is the importance of Kipchoge's mindset. When I was writing about the project for Runner's World, I was all focused on, how do the shoes work? Do they really give you 4% running economy? how was the drafting, the role, how about the carbohydrate intake, all these sorts of things. But looking back on it, it really does feel like Kipchoge had this sort of special. So there's something again that like Centro, he really come away from talking to him feeling like he has some sort of really special presence of mind, self confidence, that and something that I think he works on. All this stuff about how he reads motivational self help books and stuff like that. It's like I think he works on that in his own way. He doesn't just roll out of bed feeling ready to conquer the world. He tries to cultivate that sense of belief in his particular way. And so I've come away with a lot more respect for stuff that, I think, to go back to Lauren Fleshman's term, the woo-woo stuff, and I've told this story a few times. But the first time I met Kipchoge, he had just run, it was like 6 months before the race. He had just run a half marathon in India in like 59:45 or something like that. And I said, okay, you're gonna have to go twice as far at roughly the same pace. So what kind of changes are you going to make in your training? And his answer was, I'm not going to change my training. The training will be the same. My mind will be different. And that's the kind of stuff that I'm like, okay, but that's, that doesn't tell me anything. And that sounds like a horrible plan. Yeah. Well, so December 2016, my thought was that doesn't mean anything. Like, please. Now, a year and a half later, I said, actually, I think that did mean something. And I just wasn't kind of on the right wavelength. That was to him the most important thing, because he said it over and over again in other interviews. He said that kind of thing, that to him, creating the belief that he was ready to run sub 2 was the most important thing to him. And I couldn't hear it at the time, but looking back, I now kind of think that was maybe a really important message.
Yeah, it's difficult, right? Because we want, and science is based off, instruments that explicitly measure certain elements, right? And then we can say with certainty, this is your VO2 max, this is your lactate threshold, this is your pH in your blood. We have this concreteness about it, right? And training, the seductiveness of training can be this concept of concreteness, because we know exactly we're going to run this rep at this pace, these many, end of story. And then you get into the competitive arena and you hear the masters of craft. And this goes, in my own research in self-guided learning, trying to intersect or learn from masters of craft, it's very much more this internalization. The hard part is the belief part, the psychology. The hard part is the, not the faith, if you will, right? Belief in the absence of proof.
So, one of the things that I think is, kind of cool to me is, think about it. We had this huge science project, essentially, right? Where we're measuring all these different training variables, having all these interventions. And, we're sitting here and reflecting on it. And not talking necessarily about that stuff, but talking about the psychology, the mindset.
The intangibles.
Right?
Yes. The
intangibles. Is that... that's kind of... it's kind of interesting to...
You have no idea how frustrating it is to me as a science journalist. I want a nice study with peer review and I want a graph that I can show. That's what I want in my sort of make my life easy as a science journalist. But at the end of the day, it's
well, there's some things you can't replicate, right? Like the Mona Lisa, the Michelangelo's David, you can't replicate it. A Kipchoge, you can't replicate. And since science is about having, cold, hard, concrete facts and processes, and say there is a recipe here and we can replicate it. To a certain degree, physiology, we can say these types of sessions with this type of work-to-rest ratio at this intensity will create this physiological response. But again, sometimes it's just nice to enjoy the piece of art for what it is.
Yeah, for sure. And John, you were saying that you see similar patterns as in your study of masters of the craft in whatever the craft, and I think that's true. I think as special as Kipchoge is, we can look back at whether it's John Wooden or whatever other masters of the past. A lot of them have also spoken in similar ways about the importance of process and the importance of belief. We certainly, for me, and I think I'm not alone in this, you tend to kind of put that in one box. That's kind of like the motivational self-help box, and then there's the science box. And so I don't know, in 10 years, will Kipchoge's motivational words just be in that long line of people who happen to be really good at something and and spoke about the power of belief in this way, or will there be a change? I guess the one thing that's maybe interesting to me is, and that, not to work in the gratuitous book plug, but in researching the book, I think the reason that I'm now sort of more comfortable saying, yeah, I think this stuff is important, is that there is some research now. People are trying to quantify it in indirect ways, looking at the role of things like motivational self-talk and finding that, yeah, it allows you to push your core temperature a little higher. So you're digging deeper into reserves when you change your self-talk, but your perceived effort stays the same. And you can start to quantify that. So lots of people would say, you shouldn't need a stupid study like that to tell you what Kipchoge and the other greats have been telling you all along. And all I can say is, I'm sorry I needed it, but at least my eyes are opening now, right? So I'm hopefully sort of just starting to walk down that path of trying to understand what it is that people like Kipchoge have been trying to tell us.
Yeah, so kind of piggybacking on that a little bit, as someone who also has a science and analytical mind on things, what I'm really interested to hear you talk about a little bit on that side is the filtering portion of it, right? So if you look at coaches, right, our job is to take some of the scientific information and filter it for application of stuff. But as you know, as a scientist and a journalist in that field, like, it can be really, really difficult to figure out what is actually good and what is bad, right? Or what might not work, or what is junk science, for lack of a term. So maybe simplifying this question a little bit is, what kind of advice would you give to coaches to be able to do what it is you do, right? Compare and write up what might be the actual impact of some of this research.
Yeah. This is an important and a tough question, because I've often thought to myself that if I had a time machine and I was suddenly 20 years younger and wanted to compete again, one of the best things I could do would be to turn off this part of my mind that's so interested in digging into, so skeptical and trying to analyze evidence that it's almost self-defeating in a way, that all I do is kind of break all the levers that might otherwise help me go faster. I don't fully believe that. Like, I do believe it's good to know what works and what doesn't, that you shouldn't just kind of close your eyes and assume everything works. But I think it's really challenging, because I think there's a lot of benefit to be had. We've talked, throughout this time about the power of belief and stuff, and believing in what you're doing. So, the state of science in this area is still kind of young enough that it's possible to doubt everything. You can find someone who's informed who will tell you, name any workout, name any supplement, name any training approach. You can find someone who's like, I guarantee that doesn't work. I have science to back it up. This study shows that actually, if you want to run marathons, you should just be doing like hill reps twice a week or something like that. Like, the science is not definitive. So you have to kind of you have to do a filtering function, and I think in some cases it's useful to outsource some of that filtering function to someone like you guys, to people like you guys, to people like me, because not every coach can look at every study and evaluate every claim. So you have to find people you trust. And then from the practical perspective, I think the big thing, Trent Stellingwerff, who's a coach and scientist in Victoria, BC with the Canadian Olympic team, he articulates this really well, that it's not that you have to have 100% certainty that everything you do with your athletes is 100% proven to work. You should make sure that the balance of probabilities is that this is a reasonable thing to do with, where it's reasonable to expect that it should help without relying on any magical spells. And then if you decide you're going to do it, you should try and convey to your athletes your confidence, your faith, not that it's 100%, we know for sure it's going to work, but that there's good reason to think this is going to help you, and we're going to do it, and that's going to make sure that you are getting the best possible preparation to be at your best on race day. So we're doing this, and we're going to keep evaluating and make sure that we're not doing things that are useless. And if you can create that, then you get the best of both worlds, so that hopefully you've chosen interventions, whether it's training or supplements or whatever, that work physiologically, but also that create the confidence in the athletes that they're doing that they're getting the best possible training or interventions. So, but choosing which ones I think is kind of a Sisyphean task where everything you think you know gets wiped out every week when you open up the new journals.
Well, it matters what contest you're preparing for, right? So if you're preparing for a time trial contest, an exhibition, like Kipchoge, and this is why I tell people, like, a Kipchoge is one of the greats because he can dunk a basketball and he can make three-pointers and swishes all day. Not every player in the NBA can do both. Some can only dunk, some can only shoot a three-pointer, but they're still effective NBA players. He just has range that very few have, right? And so from an exhibitionist standpoint, from a time trial, from a get your qualification mark standpoint, that's a certain type of training for that contest. And then the other contest that we've been talking about here is now more the artistic contest, feeling out the improvisational component of a championship race where you don't know who's going to make a move, where you don't know is it going to be seesawing fast and slow. And 9 times out of 10, right, we thankfully live in a world where we do have exhibition contests at our disposal, but it's the equivalent of saying, okay, in MLB baseball, all we're going to do is home run derbies all the time, and we're just going to train for home run derbies. And you're going to get the pitch at the same thing, and it's just going to come on the machine and just try to knock it out of the park. And we're going to train like that only. And then we're going to try to put you in the World Series on Game 7, and ninth inning with everything on the line, and then we're just going to say, yep, you're prepared. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't understand there are differences in contests within the games we play, within the season, right? And so that's where, as a coach, you have to be able to explore the science, explore the research, explore the literature, explore also the psychology, because I tell people all the time, I see physiology contradicted every day at practice by psychology. And I also see physiology win 100% every day at practice as well, sometimes in the same session, right? And it's like, you shouldn't be able to do this. You're exhausted. But they got so motivated, or the athlete got so excited or just focused, right, that they overcame the physiological barriers that were happening with them and they crushed the rep. Or the exact inverse, they were so tanked, or the acidosis stays in their internally was just so high they couldn't buffer any more lactate as fuel. Everything just started to immediately decelerate and slow down, and they just looked like gunk on that 200, right? Because they're at the end of the session. So it's a yin and yang. It's a push and pull. I wish it was constant, but I always remind people, training's like the weather, right? And we have $1 billion of instruments to predict the weather, and yet we're only about 50% as good, or only at about a 50% ability. It's just as good if we guess, right? But we have $1 billion of all this meteorological equipment. It's the same deal here. It doesn't discredit the science. It actually empowers us, right? It empowers us to give us a little bit more, not certainty, but education and awareness, and say, okay, hey, here's how these things might work in balance, or things that definitely don't work. Like you said, don't sit here and do 1,000 times 400 and think you're getting better because you're the toughest person on the planet, a la CrossFit. But also, too, don't say here you're going to sit here and just do one all-out 400 every day, and that's going to get you better for a marathon, right? And so it's knowing what the tolerance is, how wide or how narrow your tolerance is for each event it is, and the contest you're training for within that event. I think we lose that sometimes. I think we think all races are the same, so there's a perfect training plan. But I've watched people run a lot of different 1500s throughout the years, and that's the demand, right? As you know yourself, being a 1500 meter runner, you can't say, oh, all marathons are the same. We have to train for all marathons like this. Like, what happens when you have Boston on a hot year, or Boston on a cold year, or CIM on a tail end year? There's all these different variables on the day on that contest that we sometimes forget when we talk about the certainty of training model.
I think those are great points. And let me just add one thing about knowing the context, and also knowing the context of the relative importance of things, just in terms of which things are worth fretting about most. Like you said, we've all seen, whether it's a race or a workout, if your head's in the right place versus in the wrong place, that's like 10% difference. So that's way more important than 0.5% difference that you might get if you use baking soda correctly, or whatever the case may be. So, and same with the workouts, as you're saying, like, getting the basic details of the workout is 99% of it. And then if you optimize the rest or your interval or optimize the pacing just right, then maybe that's the extra 1%. So allocating your energies and your mental energy towards the areas that make the biggest difference rather than spending all your time worried about the margins.
Yeah, 100%. So as we're getting near the end of this, I wanted to ask, especially coming back to your book, Endure, it's this mix of physiology and psychology. And, what I really appreciated is that you didn't wrap it up with some tidy, neat answer, right?
Believe me, I wanted to. It's just I couldn't find it.
Yeah.
Come on, I need to have the cereal box version of this. But
I as a writer and scientist, I respect that because it's it's much easier to just kind of wrap it up and be like, this is it. Let's forget the nuance and the details of there. What especially looking at the different demands of fatigue and how it holds us back in separate ways. What do you think, and we've talked a lot about self-talk here, what do you think is the takeaway for the coach or the athlete listening in terms of, approaching that psychological side or that barrier of fatigue?
Yeah, I think one of the things, and we touched on this earlier, and it's sort of maybe a takeaway from my adventures with Centro, is that you have to understand the athlete as an individual, and so to take a step back, I think that I don't think my book tells us anything new about how to improve your VO2 max, but I think to me at least the takeaway I came away with is the importance of understanding these mental factors that limits that feel physical are often mediated by the brain in ways that we don't really that aren't obvious until you start digging under the surface. And so in looking for ways to expand your performance, I think this is an area where you can start to try and systematize or at least to try and explore the things we all experience, that sometimes you're on and sometimes you're off. Sometimes you're feeling like you can do anything and sometimes you're not. And so how do we try and facilitate the conditions where an athlete feels like they can conquer the world at the start of their race or their game? And I think stuff like I think sports psychology, which I used to be somewhat skeptical of, but I think that those sorts of things like motivational self-talk can be are something to pay attention to. But I also to loop back, I think understanding that there isn't one formula for everybody, that a sort of a mantra that's going to help one athlete feel wonderful is going to feel hopelessly cheesy to another athlete. And so you have to try and help guide the athlete to the point where he or she is feeling comfortable. And you also have to try and assess that that maybe not every athlete is going to respond to rah-rah speeches in the same way that not every athlete is going to respond to some sort of drum circle or something that, getting in touch with their feelings. You have to kind of, there's only so far I could have gone in Centro's direction, right? Like I can't remake myself in his image. He's a different human than me, and every athlete is different. So I think kind of asking yourself, how can I build my team's confidence, but also how can I build the individual confidence of my athletes is maybe a place to start.
Well, maybe that's the start of your next book, My Adventures with Centro.
Centro already wrote a book, and I think everyone who has ever trained with Centro or spent a night at the bar with him has a book to write. He's and I really want to emphasize, just in case it didn't come across, I have the hugest respect for him. One of the things that someone told me just before I started training with him, I think maybe it was Scott Anderson, who was a miler back in the day, you may not always understand what he's saying, but you will, if you train with Centro, you will have this unconquerable desire. You will just so want to run well for his approval. And it's so true. He just has a magnetic personality that you just, even when I was like, why are you telling me to do this? I was still like, I just want to do it. Whatever you're telling me to do, I want to do it well, so that you're, he's kind of the paragon of one style of coach, of inspirational coaching. And so I'm really grateful for what I learned from him, even if I sometimes learned that by running poorly and realizing that I wasn't taking the right messages at the time.
And that's important because, like, a lot of the coaches we laurel in at least middle distance running, Gags, Bill Bowerman, even Arthur Lydiard, they had these larger than life magnetic personalities, right? And it goes to show you, yes, they are aware of the science. Some of them, are even science based themselves, but they fundamentally understand the bridge was that connection. The bridge was that human emotional element. And if you can get someone fired up, it's a magnitude of correctness thing again. And it's authentic for them, for that individual, right? You can probably see them create something that neither the coach nor the athlete thought they were capable of on that day of the race, or maybe in that practice, but hopefully on race day. And I know that's where I use Steve a lot and a lot of other people who are very analytical and science-based to help me, because I tend to fault a little bit more towards that emotional realm. But it's also good to see that we're having these dialogues and conversations. I think that's where the next big step is in sports performance, is a better dialogue between the philosophers and the scientists, a better dialogue between the psychologists and the coaches and the scientists, for people who have the research, have the data, have seen this expressed in the lab, but then also people who have the anecdote evidence from years and years and years of practice and seeing expressed out on the playing field. And then we'll all be better for it as long as we keep these dialogues continued. So, on behalf of Steve and I, Alex, thank you for coming on this, because it's been great to have you here talking with us for the last hour.
Well, thanks, guys. It's been a lot of fun, and I wish I'd had this conversation 20 years ago so that I could have benefited from it as an athlete.
Well, thanks a lot, Alex. And where can people check you out, see your book, anything you want to plug to our great listeners?
Yeah, probably the easiest place to find me is on Twitter. My handle's Sweat Science. And I do have a website, alexhutchinson.net, where you can get more details. But Twitter, I post, whenever I write something or see an article I'm interested in, I'll post it there. My book, Endure, is available at your local bookstore and, various, Amazon and everywhere else. So if you're interested, you can check it out there.